I see devils and demons? This is Nurse Hatchet, she-wolf of the Wolf Pack.
Bloodbath Theater Tales with your host, King of Splatter Punk, horror author William Pattison, and the horror sex symbol Christopher Highland.
Everybody, and welcome to Bloodbath Theater Tales. This is our show where Mr. Highland and I have you listen to an audiobook of a short story or a work by a famous author, and then after we host that, we do a discussion on the audio afterwards. So, along with me is the horror sex symbol and horror literary expert, Mr. Christopher Highland. How you doing, Mr. Highland?
You know what? I'm happy. Hooray.
Yeah, I know. So, anyways, Mr. Highland, did you watch that vlog that I left you last night? That was stuff that I was sitting there thinking, oh my God, the guy in the suit, he kind of reminded me of you.
Oh, I don't watch much TV, young man. You're gonna have to tell me all about it.
But anyways, yeah. Though you'd never eat a hamburger.
I haven't eaten one lately.
Yeah.
And I'm losing weight because of it.
Nice, very nice indeed. Well, we need that now that you're horror Jesus, because we need a nice thin horror Jesus. Alrighty. So, anyways, our audio presentation that we're doing tonight is one of the stories from Clive Barker's, fantastic Books of Blood series. I mean, oh man, I absolutely love the Books of Blood series. I think that was some of Clive Barker's best works were the Books of Blood. I mean, I like his longer works, but still, these stories are just so intense and they're so interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And this one is kind of like the biggest of the lot. Rawhead Rex. And anyways, the story goes that an ancient terror is set loose on a town. And it turns out that an executive who's he and his family are moving over there, he's the one that has to stop him. So, interesting little idea. Anyway, so Mr. Highland and I will be ready to discuss Rawhead Rex after we show you the production, which is read by Mr. Greg Blackman. Is it Greg Blackman or Greg Black? Mr. Highland.
I don't know. I can't remember.
Oh, you can't remember?
Nope. Nope. Nope.
Ah, here we go. Yeah, Greg Blackman is the gentleman who is doing the reading on this, and he's the one that has done the majority of the Books of Blood ones, and he did the last two that we talked about, which was the Yattering and Jack and In the Mountains, the Cities. So anyways, get ready for the thrills and the chills and the blood as we present Rawhead Rex. Enjoy.
Rawhead Rex by Clive Barker. Read by Greg Blackman. Of all the conquering armies that had tramped the streets of Zeel down the centuries, it was finally the mild tread of the Sunday tripper that brought the village to its knees. It had suffered Roman legions and the Norman conquest. It had survived the agonies of civil war, all without losing its identity to the occupying forces. But after centuries of boot and blade, it was to be the tourist, the new barbarians, that bested Zeel, their weapons, courtesy, and hard cash. It was ideally suited for the invasion. 40 miles southeast of London, amongst the orchards and hop fields of the Kentish Weald, it was far enough from the city to make the trip an adventure, yet close enough to beat a quick retreat if the weather turned foul. Every weekend, between May and October, Zeel was a watering hole for parched Londoners. They would swarm through the village on each Saturday that promised sun, bringing their dogs, their plastic balls, their litters of children, and their children's litter, disgorging them in bawling hordes onto the village green, then returning to the tall man to compare traffic stories over glasses of warm beer. For their part, the zealots weren't unduly distressed by the Sunday trippers. At least they didn't spill blood. But their lack of aggression made the invasion all the more insidious. Gradually, these city-weary people began to work a gentle but permanent change on the village. Many of them set their hearts on a home in the country. They were charmed by stone cottages set among churning oaks. They were enchanted by doves in the churchyard yews. Even the air, they'd say as they inhaled deeply, even the air smells fresher here. It smells of England. At first a few, then many, began to make bids for the empty barns and deserted houses that littered Zeel and its outskirts. They could be seen every fine weekend standing in the nettles and rubble, planning how to have a kitchen extension built and where to install the jacuzzi. And although many of them, once back in the comfort of Kilburn or St. John's Wood, chose to stay there, every year one or two of them would strike a reasonable bargain with one of the villagers and buy themselves an acre of the good life. So, as the years passed and the natives of Zeel were picked off by old age, the civil savages took over in their stead. The occupation was subtle, but the change was plain to the knowing eye. It was there in the newspapers. The post office began to stock. What native of Zeel had ever purchased a copy of Harper's and Queen magazine, or leafed through the Times literary supplement? It was there, that change, in the bright new cars that clogged the one narrow street, laughingly called the High Road, that was Zeel's backbone. It was there too in the buzz of gossip at the Tall Man, a sure sign that the affairs of the foreigners had become fit subject for debate and mockery. Indeed, as time went by, the invaders found a yet more permanent place in the heart of Zeel, as the perennial demons of their hectic lives, cancer and heart disease, took their toll, following their victims even to this new-found land. Like the Romans before them, like the Normans, like all invaders, the commuters made their profoundest mark upon this usurped turf not by building on it, but by being buried under it. It was clammy the middle of that September, Zeel's last September. Thomas Garrow, the only son of the late Thomas Garrow, was sweating up a healthy thirst as he dug in the corner of the 3-acre field. There had been a violent rainstorm the previous day, Thursday, and the earth was sodden. Clearing the ground for sowing next year hadn't been the easy job Thomas thought it'd be, but he'd sworn blind he'd have the field finished by the end of the week. It was heavy labour, clearing stones, and sorting out the detritus of out-of-date machinery his father, lazy bastard, had left to rust where it lay. Must have been some good years, Thomas thought. Some pretty fine damn years that his father could afford to let good machinery waste away. Come to think of it, that he could have afforded to leave the best part of 3 acres unploughed, good and healthy soil too. This was the Garden of England, after all. Land was money. Leaving 3-acre fallow was a luxury nobody could afford in these straitened times. But, Jesus, it was hard work. The kind of work his father had put him to in his youth, and he'd hated with a vengeance ever since. Still, it had to be done. And the day had begun well. The tractor was healthier after its overhaul, and the morning sky was rife with gulls across from the coast for a meal of freshly turned worms. They'd kept him raucous company as he worked, their insolence and their short tempers always entertaining. But then, when he came back to the field after a liquid lunch in the Tall Man, things began to go wrong. The engine started to cut out, for one, the same problem that he'd just spent £200 having seen to, and then, when he'd only been back at work a few minutes, he'd found the stone. It was an unspectacular lump of stuff poking out of the soil, perhaps a foot. Its visible diameter a few inches short of a yard, its surface smooth and bare. No lichen even, just a few grooves in its face that might once have been words. A love letter perhaps. A Kilroy was here, more likely. A date and a name likeliest of all. Whatever it had once been, monument or milestone, it was in the way now. He'd have to dig it up, or next year he'd lose a good 3 yards of ploughable land. There was no way a plough could skirt around a boulder that size. Thomas was surprised that the damn thing had been left in the field for so long without anyone bothering to remove it. But then it was a long spell since the 3-acre field had been planted, certainly not in his 36 years. And maybe, now he came to think of it, not in his father's lifetime either. For some reason, if he'd ever known the reason, he'd forgotten it, this stretch of Garrow land had been left fallow for a good many seasons, perhaps even for generations. In fact, there was a suspicion tickling the back of his skull that someone, probably his father, had said no crop would ever grow in that particular spot, but that was plain nonsense. If anything, plant life, albeit nettles and convolvulus, grew thicker and ranker in this forsaken 3 acres than in any other plot in the district. So there was no reason on earth why hops shouldn't flourish here. Maybe even an orchard, though that took more patience and love than Thomas suspected he possessed. Whatever he chose to plant, it would surely spring up from such rich ground with a rare enthusiasm, and he'd have reclaimed 3 acres of good land to bolster his shaky finances. If he could just dig out that bloody stone. He'd half thought of hiring in one of the earth movers from the building site at the north end of the village, just to haul itself across here and get its mechanical jaws working on the problem. Have the stone out and away in 2 seconds flat. But his pride resisted the idea of running for help at the first sign of a blister. The job was too small anyhow. He'd dig it out himself, the way his father would have done. That's what he'd decided. Now, 2.5 hours later, he was regretting his haste. The ripening warmth of the afternoon had soured in that time, and the air, without much of a breeze to stir it around, had become stifling. Over from the downs came a stuttering roll of thunder, and Thomas could feel the static crawling at the nape of his neck, making the short hairs there stand up. The sky above the field was empty now. The gulls, too fickle to hang around once the fun was over, had taken some salt-smelling thermal. Even the earth, that had given up a sweet, sharp flavour as the blades turned it that morning, now smelt joyless, and as he dug the black soil out from around the stone, his mind returned helplessly to the putrefaction that made it so very rich. His thoughts circled vacuously on the countless little deaths on every spadeful of soil he dug. This wasn't the way he was used to thinking, and the morbidity of it distressed him. He stopped for a moment, leaning on his spade and regretting the 4th pint of Guinness he'd downed at lunch. That was normally a harmless enough ration, but today it swilled around in his belly. He could hear it, as dark as the soil on his spade, working up a scum of stomach acid and half-digested food. Think of something else, he told himself, or you'll get to puking. To take his mind off his belly, he looked at the field. It was nothing out of the ordinary, just a rough square of land, bounded by an untrimmed hawthorn hedge. 1 or 2 dead animals lying in the shadow of the hawthorn. A starling, something else too far gone to be recognisable. There was a sense of absence, but that wasn't so unusual. It would soon be autumn, and the summer had been long, too hot for comfort. Looking up higher than the hedge, he watched the Mongol-headed cloud discharge a flicker of lightning to the hills. What had been the brightness of the afternoon was now pressed into a thin line of blue at the horizon. Rain soon, he thought, and the thought was welcome. Cool rain. Perhaps a downpour like the previous day. Maybe this time it would clear the air good and proper. Thomas stared back down at the unyielding stone and struck it with his spade. A tiny arc of white flame flew off. He cursed loudly and inventively. The stone, himself, the field. The stone just sat there in the moat he'd dug around it, defying him. He'd almost run out of options. The earth around the thing had been dug out 2 feet down. He'd hammered stakes under it, chained it, and then got the tractor going to haul it out. No joy. Obviously he'd have to dig the moat deeper, drive the stakes further down. He wasn't going to let the damn thing beat him. Grunting his determination, he set to digging again. A fleck of rain hit the back of his head, but he scarcely noticed it. He knew by experience that labour like this took singularity of purpose. Head down, ignore all distractions. He made his mind blank. There was just the earth, the spade, the stone, and his body. Push down, scoop up. Push down, scoop up. A hypnotic rhythm of effort. The trance was so total, he wasn't sure how long he worked before the stone began to shift. The movement woke him. He stood upright, his vertebrae clicking, not quite certain that the shift was anything more than a twitch in his eye. Putting his heel against the stone, he pushed. Yes, it rocked in its grave. He was too drained to smile, but he felt victory close. He had the bugger. The rain was starting to come on heavier now, and it felt fine on his face. He drove a couple more stakes in the ground around the stone to unseat it a little further. He was going to get the better of the thing. You'll see, he said, you'll see. The 3rd stake went deeper than the first 2, and it seemed to puncture a bubble of gas beneath the stone. A yellowish cloud smelling so foul he stepped away from the hole to snatch a breath of purer air. There was none to be had. All he could do was hock up a wad of phlegm to clear his throat and lungs. Whatever was under the stone, and there was something animal in the stench. It was very rotten. He forced himself back down to the work, taking gasps of the air into his mouth, not through his nostrils. His head felt tight, as though his brain was swelling and straining against the dome of his skull, pushing to be let out. "Fuck you," he said, and beat another stake under the stone. His back felt as though it was about to break. On his right hand, a blister had bust. A clegg sat on his arm and feasted itself, unswatted. Do it. Do it. Do it. He beat the last stake in without knowing he was doing it. And then the stone began to roll. He wasn't even touching it. The stone was being pushed out of its seating from beneath. He reached for his spade, which was still wedged under the stone. He suddenly felt possessive of it. It was his, a part of him. He didn't want it near the hole. Not now. Not with the stone rocking it like it had a geyser under it about to blow. Not with the air yellow and his brain swelling up like a marrow in August. He pulled hard on his spade. It wouldn't come. He cursed it and took two hands to the job, keeping at arm's length from the hole as he hauled, the increasing motion of the stone slinging up showers of soil, lice and pebbles. He heaved at the spade again, but it wouldn't give. He didn't stop to analyse the situation. The work had sickened him. All he wanted was to get his spade, out of the hole and get the hell out of there. The stone bucked, but still he wouldn't let go of the spade. It had become fixed in his head that he had to have it before he could leave. Only when it was back in his hands, safe and sound, would he obey his bowels and run. Beneath his feet, the ground began to erupt. The stone rolled away from the tomb as if feather light. A second cloud of gas, more obnoxious than the first, seemed to blow it on its way. At the same time, the spade came out of the hole, and Thomas saw what had hold of it. Suddenly, there was no sense in heaven or earth. There was a hand, a living hand clutching the spade, a hand so wide it could grasp the blade with ease. Thomas knew the moment well, the splitting earth, the hand, the stench. He knew it from some nightmare he'd heard at his father's knee. Now he wanted to let go of the spade, but he no longer had the will. All he could do was obey some imperative from underground, to haul until his ligaments tore and his sinews bled. Beneath the thin crust of earth, Rawhead smelt the sky. It was pure ether to his dulled senses, making him sick with pleasure. Kingdoms for the taking, just a few inches away. After so many years, after the endless suffocation, there was light on his eyes again, and the taste of human terror upon his tongue. His head was breaking the surface now, his black hair wreathed with worms, his scalp seething with tiny red spiders. They'd irritated him 100 years, those spiders burrowing into his marrow, and he longed to crush them out. Pull, pull, he willed the human, and Thomas Garrow pulled until his pitiful body had no strength left, and inch by inch Rawhead was hoisted out of his grave in a shroud of prayers. The stone that had pressed on him for so long had been removed, and he was dragging himself up easily now, slothing off the grave earth like a snake its skin. His torso was free, shoulders twice as broad as a man's, lean, scarred arms, stronger than any human. His limbs were pumping with blood like a butterfly's wings, juicing with resurrection. His long, lethal fingers rhythmically clawed the ground as they gained strength. Thomas Garrow just stood and watched. There was nothing in him but awe. Fear was for those who still had a chance of life. He had none. Rawhead was out of his grave completely. He began to stand upright for the first time in centuries. Clods of damp soil fell from his torso as he stretched to his full height, a yard above Garrow's 6 feet. Thomas Garrow stood in Rawhead's shadow with his eyes still fixed on the gaping hole the king had risen from. In his right hand he still clutched the spade, Rawhead picked him up by the hair. His scalp tore under the weight of his body, so Rawhead seized Garrow round the neck, his vast hand easily enclosing it. Blood ran down Garrow's face from his scalp, and the sensation stirred him. Death was imminent, and he knew it. He looked down at his legs, thrashing uselessly below him. Then he looked up and stared directly into Rawhead's pitiless face. It was huge, like the harvest moon, huge and amber. But this moon had eyes that burned in its pallid, pitted face. They were for all the world like wounds, those eyes, as though somebody had gouged them in the flesh of Rawhead's face, then sat 2 candles to flicker in the holes. Garrow was entranced by the vastness of this moon. He looked from eye to eye, and then to the wet slits that were its nose, and finally, in a childish terror, down to the mouth. God, that mouth! It was so wide, so cavernous, it seemed to split the head in 2 as it opened. That was Thomas Garrow's last thought, that the moon was splitting in 2 and falling out of the sky on top of him. Then the king inverted the body, as had always been his way with his dead enemies, and drove Thomas head first into the hole, winding him down into the very grave his forefathers had intended to bury Rawhead in forever. By the time the thunderstorm proper broke over Zeel, the king was a mile away from the 3-acre field, sheltering in the Nicholson barn. In the village, everyone went about their business, rain or no rain. Ignorance was bliss. There was no Cassandra among them, nor had Your Future in the Stars in that week's Gazette even hinted at the sudden deaths to come to a Gemini, 3 Leos, a Sagittarian, and a minor star system of others in the next few days. The rain had come with the thunder, fat, cool spots of it, which rapidly turned into a downpour of monsoonal ferocity. Only when the gutters became torrents did people begin to take shelter. On the building site, the earth mover that had been roughly landscaping Ronnie Milton's back garden sat idling in the rain, receiving a second washdown in 2 days. The driver had taken the downpour as a signal to retire into the hut and to talk racehorses and women. In the doorway of the post office, 3 of the villagers watched the drains backing up and tutted that this always happened when it rained, and in half an hour there'd be a pool of water in the dip at the bottom of the high street, so deep you could sail a boat on it. And down in the dip itself, in the vestry of St. Peter's, Declan Ewan, the verger, watched the rain pelting down the hill in eager rivulets and gathering into a little sea outside the vestry gate. Soon be deep enough to drown in, he thought, and then, puzzled by why he imagined drowning, he turned away from the window and went back to the business of folding vestments. A strange excitement was in him today, and he didn't want to suppress it. It was nothing to do with the thunderstorm, though he'd always loved them since he was a child. No, there was something else stirring him up, and he was damned if he knew what. It was like being a child again, as if it was Christmas, and at any minute Santa, the first Lord he'd ever believed in, would be at the door. The very idea made him want to laugh out loud, but the vestry was too sober a place for laughter, and he stopped himself, letting the smile curl inside him. A secret hope. While everyone else took refuge from the rain, Gwen Nicholson was getting thoroughly drenched. She was still in the yard behind the house, coaxing Amelia's pony towards the barn. The thunder had made the stupid beast jittery, and it didn't want to budge. Now Gwen was soaked and angry. "Will you come on, you brute?" she yelled at it over the noise of the storm. The rain lashed the yard and pummeled the top of her head. Her hair was flattened. "Come on, come on!" The pony refused to budge. Its eyes showed crescents of white in its fear, and the more the thunder rolled and crackled around the yard, the less it wanted to move. Angrily, Gwen slapped it across the backside, harder than she strictly needed to. It took a couple of steps in response to the blow, dropping steaming turds as it went, and Gwen took the advantage. Once she had it moving, she could drag it the rest of the way. "Warm barn," she promised it. "Come on, it's wet out here. You don't want to stay out here." The barn door was slightly ajar. Surely it must look like an inviting prospect, she thought, even to a pea-brained pony. She dragged it to within spitting distance of the barn, and one more slap got it through the door. As she'd promised the damn thing, the interior of the barn was sweet and dry, though the air smelt metallic with the storm. Gwen tied the pony to the crossbar in its stall and roughly threw a blanket over its glistening hide. She was damned if she was going to swab the creature down. That was Amelia's job. That was the bargain she'd made with her daughter when they'd agreed to buy the pony, that all grooming and clearing out would be Amelia's responsibility. And to be fair to her, she'd done what she promised, more or less. The pony was still panicking. It stamped and rolled its eyes like a bad tragedian. There were flecks of foam on its lips. A little apologetically, Gwen patted its flank. She'd lost her temper. Time of the month. Now she regretted it. She only hoped Amelia hadn't been at her bedroom window watching. A gust of wind caught the barn door and it swung closed. The sound of rain on the yard outside was abruptly muted. It was suddenly dark. The pony stopped stamping. Gwen stopped stroking its hide. Everything stopped. Her heart too, it seemed. Behind her, a figure that was almost twice her size rose from beyond the bales of hay. Gwen didn't see the giant, but her innards churned. Damn periods, she thought, rubbing her lower belly in a slow circle. She was normally as regular as clockwork, but this month she'd come on a day early. She should go back to the house, get changed, get clean. Rawhead stood and looked at the nape of Gwen Nicholson's neck, where a single nip would easily kill. But there was no way he could bring himself to touch this woman. Not today. She had the blood cycle on her. He could taste its tang, and it sickened him. It was taboo, that blood, and he had never taken a woman poisoned by its presence. Feeling the damp between her legs, Gwen hurried out of the barn without looking behind her and ran through the downpour back to the house, leaving the fretting pony in the darkness of the barn. Rawhead heard the woman's feet recede, heard the house door slam. He waited to be sure she wouldn't come back. Then he padded across to the animal, reached down and took a hold of it. The pony kicked and complained, but Rawhead had in his time taken animals far bigger and far better armed than this. He opened his mouth. The gums were suffused with blood as the teeth emerged from them, like claws unsheathed from a cat's paw. There were 2 rows on each jaw, 24 needle-sharp points. They gleamed as they closed around the meat of the pony's neck. Thick, fresh blood poured down Rawhead's throat. He gulped it greedily. The hot taste of the world. It made him feel strong and wise. This was only the first of many meals he would take. He'd gorge on anything that took his fancy, and nobody would stop him. Not this time. And when he was ready, he'd throw those pretenders off his throne. He'd cremate them in their houses. He'd slaughter their children and wear their infants' bowels as necklaces. This place was his. Just because they tamed the wilderness for a while didn't mean they owned the earth. It was his, and nobody would take him from him, not even the holiness. He was wise to that too. They'd never subdue him again. He sat cross-legged on the floor of the barn, the grey-pink intestines of the pony coiled around him, planning his tactics as best he could. He'd never been a great thinker. Too much appetite. It overwhelmed his reason. He lived in the eternal present of his hunger and his strength, feeling only the crude territorial instinct that would sooner or later blossom into carnage. rain didn't let up for over an hour. Ron Milton was becoming impatient. A flaw in his nature that had given him an ulcer and a top-flight job in design consultancy. What Milton could get done for you couldn't be done quicker. He was the best, and he hated sloth in other people as much as in himself. Take this damn house, for instance. They promised it would be finished by mid-July, garden landscape, driveway laid, everything, and here he was, 2 months after that date, looking at a house that was still far from habitable. Half the windows without glass, the front door missing, the garden an assault course, the driveway a mire. This was to be his castle, his retreat from a world that made him dyspeptic and rich, a haven away from the hassles of the city, where Maggie could grow roses and the children could breathe clean air. Except that it wasn't ready. Damn it, at this rate he wouldn't be in until next spring, another winter in London. The thought made his heart sink. Maggie joined him, sheltering him under a red umbrella. "Where are the kids?" he asked. She grimaced. "Back at the hotel, driving Mrs. Blatter crazy." Enid Blatter had borne their cavortings for half a dozen weekends through the summer. She'd had kids of her own, and she handled Debbie and Ian with aplomb, but there was a limit even to her fund of mirth and merriment. "We'd better get back to town." "No, please let's stay another day or two. We can go back on Sunday evening. I want us all to go to the Harvest Festival service on Sunday." Now it was Ron's turn to grimace. "Oh, hell. It's all part of village life, Ronnie. If we're going to live here, we have to become part of the community." He whined like a little boy when he was in this kind of mood. She knew him so well she could hear his next words before he said them. "I don't want to." "Well, we've no choice." "We can go back tonight." "Ronnie, there's nothing we could do here. The kids are bored. You're miserable." Maggie had set her features in concrete. She wasn't going to budge an inch. He knew that face as well as she knew his whining. He studied the puddles that were forming in what might one day be their front garden, unable to imagine grass there, roses there. It all suddenly seemed impossible. "You go back to town if you like, Ronnie. Take the kids. I'll stay here. Train at home on Sunday night." Clever, he thought, to give him a get-out that's more unattractive than staying put. 2 days in town looking after the kids alone? No, thank you. "Okay, you win. We'll go to the Harvest Bloody Festival." "Martyr." As long as I don't have to pray. Amelia Nicholson ran into the kitchen, her round face white, and collapsed in front of her mother. There was greasy vomit on her green plastic Macintosh and blood on her green plastic Wellingtons. Gwen yelled for Denny. Their little girl was shivering in her faint, her mouth chewing at a word or words that wouldn't come. "What is it?" Denny was thundering down the stairs. "For Christ's sake!" Amelia was vomiting again. Her face was practically blue. "What's wrong with her?" "She just came in. You better ring for an ambulance." Denny put his hand on her cheek. "She's in shock." "Ambulance! Denny!" Gwen was taking off the green Macintosh and loosening the child's blouse. Slowly, Denny stood up. Through the rain-laced window he could see into the yard. The barn door flapped open and closed in the wind. Somebody was inside. He glimpsed movement. "For Christ's sake, an ambulance!" Gwen said again. Denny wasn't listening. There was someone in his barn, on his property, and he had a strict ritual for trespassers. The barn door opened again, teasing. Yes, retreating into the dark. Interloper. He picked up the rifle beside the door, keeping his eyes on the yard as much as he could. Behind him, Gwen had left Amelia on the kitchen floor and was dialing for help. The girl was moaning now. She was going to be okay. Just some filthy trespasser scaring her, that's all. On his land. He opened the door and stepped into the yard. He was in his shirt sleeves and the wind was bitingly cold, but the rain had stopped. Underfoot, the ground glistened, and drips fell from every eave and portico, a fidgety percussion that accompanied him across the yard. The barn door swung listlessly ajar again, and this time stayed open. He could see nothing inside, half wondered if a trick of the light had... But no. He'd seen someone moving in here. The barn wasn't empty. Something, not the pony, was watching him even now. They'd see the rifle in his hands, And they'd sweat. Let 'em come into his place like that. Let them think he was going to blow their balls off. He covered the distance in a half-dozen confident strides and stepped into the barn. The pony's stomach was beneath his shoe, one of its legs to his right, the upper shank gnawed to the bone. Pools of thickening blood reflected the holes in the roof. The mutilation made him want to heave. "Oh, all right," he challenged the shadows. "Come out!" He raised his rifle. "You hear me, you bastard? Out, I said, or I'll blow you to kingdom come." He meant it too. At the far end of the barn, something stirred amongst the bales. "Now I've got the son of a bitch," thought Denny. The trespasser got up, all 9 feet of him, and stared at Denny. "Jesus!" And without warning it was coming at him, coming like a locomotive, smooth and efficient. He fired into it and the bullet struck its upper chest, but the wound hardly slowed it. Nicholson turned and ran. The stones of the yard were slippery beneath his shoes and he had no turn of speed to outrun it. It was at his back in 2 beats and on him in another. Gwen dropped the phone when she heard the shot. She raced to the window in time to see her sweet Denny eclipsed by a gargantuan form. It howled as it took him and threw him up into the air like a sack of feathers. She watched helplessly as his body twisted at the apex of its journey before plummeting back down to earth again. It hit the yard with a thud she felt in her every bone, and the giant was at his body like a shot, treading his loving face to muck. She screamed, trying to silence herself with her hand. Too late. The sound was out, and the giant was looking at her, straight at her, its malice piercing the window. Oh God, it had seen her, and now it was coming for her, loping across the yard, a naked engine, and grinning a promise at her as it came. Gwen snatched Amelia off the floor and hugged her close, pressing the girl's face against her neck. Maybe she wouldn't see. She mustn't see. The sound of its feet slapping on the wet yard got louder. Its shadow filled the kitchen. "Jesus, help me!" It was pressing at the window, its body so wide that it cancelled out the light. Its lewd, revolting face smeared on the watery pane. Then it was smashing through, ignoring the glass that bit into its flesh. It smelled child meat. It wanted child meat. It would have child meat. Its teeth were spilling into view, widening that smile into an obscene laugh. Ropes of saliva hung from its jaw as it clawed the air like a cat after a mouse in a cage. Pressing further and further in, each swipe closer to the morsel. Gwen flung open the door into the hall as the thing lost patience with snatching and began to demolish the window frame and clamber through. She locked the door after her while crockery smashed and wood splintered on the other side. Then she began to load all the hall furniture against it. Tables, chairs, coat stand, knowing even as she did it that it would be matchwood in 2 seconds flat. Amelia was kneeling on the hall floor where Gwen had set her down. Her face was a thankful blank. All right, that was all she could do. Now upstairs. She picked up her daughter, who was suddenly air-light, and took the stairs 2 at a time. Halfway up, the noise in the kitchen below stopped utterly. She suddenly had a reality crisis. On the landing where she stood, all was peace and calm. Dust gathered minutely on the window sills. Flowers wilted. All the infinitesimal domestic procedures went on as though nothing had happened. "Dreaming it," she said. "God, yes, dreaming it." She sat down on the bed Denny and she had slept in together for 8 years and tried to think straight. Some vile menstrual nightmare, that's what it was, some rape fantasy out of all control. She lay Amelia on the pink eider down. Denny hated pink, but suffered it for her sake, and stroked the girl's clammy forehead. Dreaming it. Then the room darkened, and she looked up, knowing what she'd see. It was there, the nightmare, all over the upper windows, its spidery arms spanning the width of the glass, clinging like an acrobat to the frame, its repellent teeth sheathing and unsheathing as it gawped at her terror. In one swooping movement she snatched Amelia up from the bed and dived towards the door. Behind her, glass shattered and a gust of cold air swept into the bedroom. It was coming. She ran across the landing to the top of the stairs, but it was after her in a heart's beat, ducking through the bedroom door, its mouth a tunnel. It whooped as it reached to steal the mute parcel in her arms, huge in the confined space of the building. She couldn't outrun it. She couldn't outfight it. Its hands fixed on Amelia with insolent ease, and tugged. The child screamed as it took her, her fingernails raking 4 furrows across her mother's face as she left her arms. Gwen stumbled back, dizzied by the unthinkable sight in front of her, and lost balance at the top of the stairs. As she fell backwards, she saw Amelia's tear-stained face, dull stiff, being fed between those rows of teeth. Then her head hit the banister and her neck broke. She bounced down the last 6 steps, a corpse. The rainwater had drained away a little by early evening, but the artificial lake at the bottom of the dip still flooded the road to a depth of several inches. Serenely, it reflected the sky. Pretty, but inconvenient. Reverend Coote quietly reminded Declan Ewan to report the blocked drains to the county council. It was the 3rd time of asking, and Declan blushed at the request. "Sorry, I'll—" "All right, no problem, Declan, but we really must get them cleared." A vacant look. A beat. A thought. Autumn fall always clogs them again, of course. Coote made a roughly cynical gesture, intending a sort of observation about how it really wouldn't make that much difference when or if the council cleared the drains. Then the thought disappeared. There were more pressing issues. For one, the Sunday sermon. For a second, the reason why he couldn't make much sense of sermon writing this evening. There was an unease in the air today that made every reassuring word he committed to paper curdle as he wrote it. Coote went to the window, back to Declan, and scratched his palms. They itched. Maybe an attack of eczema again. If he could only speak, find some words to shape his distress. Never in his 45 years had he felt so incapable of communication, and never in those years had it been so vital that he talk. "Shall I go now?" Declan asked. Coote shook his head. A moment longer, if you would." He turned to the verger. Declan Ewan was 29, though he had the face of a much older man. Bland, pale features, his hair receding prematurely. "What will this egg face make of my revelation?" thought Coote. "He'll probably laugh. That's why I can't find the words, because I don't want to. I'm afraid of looking stupid. Here I am, a man of the cloth, dedicated to the Christian mysteries. For the first time in 40-odd years, I've had a real glimpse of something, a vision, maybe, and I'm scared of being laughed at. Stupid man, Coote. Stupid, stupid man." He took off his glasses. Declan's empty features became a blur. Now at least he didn't have to look at the smirking. "Declan, this morning I had what I can only describe as a visitation." Declan said nothing, nor did the blur move. "I don't quite know how to say this. Our vocabulary is impoverished when it comes to these sort of things. But frankly, I've never had such a direct, such an unequivocal manifestation of..." Coote stopped. Did he mean God? "God," he said, not sure that he did. Declan said nothing for a moment. Coote risked returning his glasses to their place. The egg hadn't cracked. "Can you say what it was like?" Declan asked, his equilibrium absolutely unspoiled. Coote shook his head. He'd been trying to find the words all day, but the phrases all seemed so predictable. "What was it like?" Declan insisted. Why didn't he understand that there were no words? "I must try," thought Coote. "I must." "I was at the altar after morning prayer," he began, "and I felt something going through me, like electricity almost. It made my hair stand on end, literally on end." Coote's hand was running through his short cropped hair as he remembered the sensation. The hair standing bolt upright like a field of grey ginger corn, and that buzzing at the temples, in his lungs, at his groin. It had actually given him a hard-on, not that he was going to be able to tell Declan that, but he stood there at the altar with an erection so powerful it was like discovering the joy of lust all over again. I can't claim that it was our Lord God, though he wanted to believe that his God was the Lord of the hard-on. I can't even claim it was Christian. But something happened today, I felt it. Declan's face was still impenetrable. Coote watched it for several seconds, impatient for its disdain. "Well?" he demanded. "Well, what?" "Nothing to say?" The egg frowned for a moment, a furrow in its shell. Then it said, "God help us." "What?" "I felt it too. Not quite as you describe, not quite an electric shock, but something." "Why God help us, Declan? Are you afraid of something?" He made no reply. "If you know something about these experiences that I don't, please tell me. I want to know, to understand. God, I have to understand." Declan pursed his lips. "Well," his eyes became more indecipherable than ever, and for the first time Coote caught a glimpse of a ghost behind Declan's eyes. Was it despair, perhaps? "There's a lot of history to this place, you know," he said. "History of things on this site." Coote knew Declan had been delving into Zeel's history. Harmless enough pastime, the past was the past. There had been a settlement here for centuries, stretches back well before Roman occupation. No one knows how long. There's probably always been a temple on this site. There was nothing odd about that. Coote offered up a smile, inviting Declan to reassure him. A part of him wanted to be told everything was well with his world, even if it was a lie. Declan's face darkened. He had no reassurance to give. And there was a forest here. Huge. The wild woods. Was it still despair behind the eyes? Or was it nostalgia? Not some tame little orchard. A forest you could lose a city in. Full of beasts. Wolves, you mean? Bears? Declan shook his head. There were things that owned this land before Christ, before civilization. Most of them didn't survive the destruction of their natural habitat. Too primitive, I suppose. But strong. Not like us, not human. Something else altogether. Well, so what? One of them survived as late as the 1400s. There's a carving of it being buried. It's on the altar. On the altar? Underneath the cloth. I found it a while ago. I never thought much of it till today. Today I tried to touch it. He produced his fist and unclenched it. The flesh of his palm was blistered. Pus ran from the broken skin. It doesn't hurt, he said. In fact, it's quite numb. Serves me right, really. I should have known. Coote's first thought was that the man was lying. His second was that there was some logical explanation. His third was his father's dictum. Logic is the last refuge of a coward. Declan was speaking again. This time he was seeping excitement. They called it Rawhead. What? The beast they buried. It's in the history books. Rawhead it was called because its head was huge and the colour of the moon and raw, like meat. Declan couldn't stop himself now. He was beginning to smile. It ate children, he said, and beamed like a baby about to receive its mother's tit. It wasn't until early on the Saturday morning that the atrocity at the Nicholson farm was discovered. Mick Glossop had been driving up to London, and he'd taken the road that ran beside the farm. Don't know why, don't usually. Funny, really. And Nicholson's Frisian herd was kicking up a row at the gate, their udders distended. They'd clearly not been milked in 24 hours. Glossop had stopped his jeep on the road and got into the yard. The body of Denny Nicholson was already crawling with flies, though the sun had barely been up an hour. Inside the house, the only remains of Amelia Nicholson were shreds of a dress and a casually discarded foot. Gwen Nicholson's unmutilated body lay at the bottom of the stairs. There was no sign of a wound or any sexual interference with the corpse. By 9:30, Zeel was swarming with police, and the shock of the incident registered on every face in the street. Although there were conflicting reports as to the state of the bodies, there was no doubt of the brutality of the murders, especially the child, dismembered presumably, her body taken away by her killer for God knows what purpose. The murder squad set up a unit at The Tall Man, while house-to-house interviews were conducted throughout the village. Nothing came immediately to light, no strangers seen in the locality, no more suspicious behaviour from anyone than was normal for a poacher or a bent building merchant. It was Enid Blatter, she of the ample bust and the motherly manner, who mentioned that she hadn't seen Tom Garrow for over 24 hours. They found him where his killer had left him, the worse for a few hours of picking. Worms at his head and gulls at his legs. The flesh of his shins, where his trousers had slid out of his boots, was pecked to the bone. When he was dug up, families of refugee lice scurried from his ears. The atmosphere in the hotel that night was subdued. In the bar, Detective Sergeant Gissing, down from London to head the investigation, had found a willing ear in Ron Milton. He was glad to be conversing with a fellow Londoner, and Milton kept them both in scotch and water for the best part of 3 hours. 20 years in the force, Gissing kept repeating, and I've never seen anything like it. Which wasn't strictly true. There'd been that whore, or selected highlights thereof, he'd found in a suitcase at Euston's left luggage department a good decade ago. And the addict who'd taken it upon himself to hypnotise a polar bear at London Zoo. He'd been a sight for sore eyes when they dragged him out of the pool. He'd seen a good deal, had Stanley Gissing. But this... I've never seen anything like this, he insisted. Fair made me want to puke. Ron wasn't quite sure why he listened to Gissing. It was just something to while the night away. Ron, who'd been a radical in his younger days, had never liked policemen much, and there was some quirky satisfaction to be had from getting this self-satisfied prat pissed out of his tiny skull. He's a fucking lunatic, Gissing said. You can take my word for it, we'll have him easy. A man like that, he's not in control. You see, it doesn't bother to cover his tracks, doesn't even care if he lives or dies. God knows, any man who tear a 7-year-old girl to shreds like that, he's on the verge of going bang. Seen him. Yeah? Oh yeah, I've seen him weep like children, blood all over him like they was just out of the abattoir. Tears on their faces, pathetic. So you'll have him? Like that, said Gissing, and snapped his fingers. He got to his feet a little unsteadily. Sure as God made little apples, we'll have him. He glanced at his watch, and then at the empty glass. Ron made no further offer of refills. Well, said Gissing, I must be getting back to town. Put in my report. He swayed to the door, and left Milton to the bill. Rawhead watched Gissing's car crawl out of the village and along the North Road, the headlights making very little impression on the night. The noise of the engine made Rawhead nervous, though, as it over-revved up the hill past the Nicholson farm. It roared and coughed like no beast he had encountered before, and somehow the Homo sapiens had control of it. If the kingdom was to be taken back from the usurpers, sooner or later, he would have to best one of these beasts. Rawhead swallowed his fear and prepared for the confrontation. The moon grew teeth. In the back of the car, Stanley was near as damn it asleep, dreaming of little girls. In his dreams, these charming nymphettes were climbing a ladder on their way to bed, and he was on duty beside the ladder, watching them climb, catching glimpses of their slightly soiled knickers as they disappeared into the sky. It was a familiar dream, one that he would never have admitted to, not even drunk. Not that he was ashamed exactly, he knew for a fact many of his colleagues entertained peccadilloes every bit as off-base, and some a good deal less savoury than him. But he was possessive of it. It was his particular dream, and he wasn't about to share it with anyone. In the driving seat, the young officer who'd been chauffeuring Gissing around for the best part of 6 months was waiting for the old man to fall well and truly asleep. Then, and only then, could he risk turning the radio on to catch up with the cricket scores. Australia were well down in the test. A late rally seemed unlikely. Ah, now there was a career, he thought as he drove. Beats this routine into a cocked hat. Both lost in their reveries, driver and passenger. Neither caught sight of Rawhead. He was stalking the car now, his giant stride easily keeping pace with it as it navigated the winding, unlit road. All at once his anger flared, and roaring, he left the field for the tarmac. The driver swerved to avoid the immense form that skipped into the burning headlights, its mouth issuing a howl like a pack of rabid dogs. The car skidded on the wet ground, its left wing grazing the bushes that ran along the side of the road, a tangle of branches lashing the windscreen as it careered on its way. On the back seat, Gissing fell off the ladder he was climbing just as the car came to the end of its hedgerow tour and met an iron gate. Gissing was flung against the front seat, winded but uninjured. The impact took the driver over the wheel and through the window in 2 short seconds. His feet, now in Gissing's face, twitched. From the road, Rawhead watched the death of the metal box. Its tortured voice, the howl of its wrenched flank, the shattering of its face frightened him. But it was dead. He waited a few cautious moments before advancing up the road to sniff the crumpled body. There was an aromatic smell in the air which pricked his sinuses, and the cause of it, the blood of the box, was dribbling out of its broken torso and running away down the road. Certain now that it must be finished, he approached. There was someone alive in the box. None of the sweet child flesh he savoured so much, just tough male meat. It was a comical face that peered at him. Round, wild eyes. Its silly mouth opened and closed like a fish's. He kicked the box to make it open, and when that didn't work, he wrenched off the doors. Then he reached and drew the whimpering male out of his refuge. Was this one of the species that had subdued him? This fearful mite with its jelly lips? He laughed at its pleas, then turned Gissing on his head, held him upside down by 1 foot. He waited until the cries died down, then reached between the twitching legs and found the mite's manhood. Not large, quite shrunk in fact by fear. Gissing was blathering all kinds of stuff, none of it made any sense. The only sound Rawhead understood from the mouth of the man was this sound he was hearing now, this high-pitched shriek that always attended a gelding. Once finished, he dropped Gissing behind the car. A fire had begun in the smashed engine. He could smell it. He was not so much a beast that he feared fire. Respected it, yes, but not feared. Fire was a tool. He'd used it many times to burn out enemies, to cremate them in their beds. Now he stepped back from the car as the flame found the petrol, and fire erupted into the air. Heat balled towards him, and he smelt the air on the front of his body crisp, but he was too entranced by the spectacle not to look. The fire followed the blood of the beast, consuming Gissing and licking along the rivers of petrol like an eager dog after a trail of piss. Rawhead watched and learned a new and lethal lesson. In the chaos of his study, Coote was unsuccessfully fighting off sleep. He'd spent a good deal of the evening at the altar, some of it with Declan. Tonight there'd be no praying, just sketching. Now he had a copy of the altar carving on his desk in front of him, and he'd spent an hour just staring at it. The exercise had been fruitless. Either the carving was too ambiguous, or his imagination lacked breadth. Whichever, he could make very little sense of the image. It pictured a burial, certainly, but that was about all he was able to work out. Maybe the body was a little bigger than that of the mourners, but nothing exceptional. He thought of Zeel's pub, the tall man, and smiled. It might well have pleased some medieval wit to picture the burial of a brewer under the altar cloth. In the hall, the sick clock struck 12:15, which meant it was almost 1. Coote got up from his desk, stretched, and switched off the lamp. He was surprised by the brilliance of the moonlight streaming through the crack in the curtain. It was a full harvest moon, and the light, though cold, was luxuriant. He put the guard in front of the fire and stepped into the darkened hallway, closing the door behind him. The clock ticked loudly. Somewhere over towards Goudhurst, he heard the sound of an ambulance siren. What's happening? He wondered, and opened the front door to see what he could see. There were car headlights on the hill and the distant throb of blue police lights, more rhythmical than the ticking at his back. Accident on the North Road. Early for ice and surely not cold enough. He watched the lights, set on the hill like jewels on the back of a whale, winking away. It was quite chilly, come to think of it. No weather to be standing in. He frowned. Something caught his eye. A movement in the far corner of the churchyard, underneath the trees. The moonlight etched the scene in monochrome, black yews, grey stones, a white chrysanthemum strewing its petals on a grave, and black in the shadow of the yews, but outlined clearly against the slab of a marble tomb beyond. A giant. Coot stepped out of the house in slippered feet. The giant was not alone. Somebody was kneeling in front of it, a smaller, more human shape, its face raised and clear in the light. It was Declan. Even from a distance it was clear that he was smiling up at his master. Coot wanted to get closer, a better look at the nightmare. As he took his third step, his foot crunched on a piece of gravel. The giant seemed to shift in the shadows. Was it turning to look at him? Coot chewed on his heart. No, let it be deaf, please God, let it not see me, make me invisible. The prayer was apparently answered. The giant made no sign of having seen his approach. Taking courage, Coot advanced across the pavement of gravestones, dodging from tomb to tomb for cover, barely daring to breathe. He was within a few feet of the tableau now, and he could see the way the creature's head was bowed towards Declan. He could hear the sound like sandpaper on stone it was making at the back of his throat, but there was more to the scene. Declan's vestments were torn and dirtied, his thin chest bare. Moonlight caught his sternum, his ribs. His state and his position were unequivocal. This was adoration, pure and simple. Then Coot heard the splashing. He stepped closer and saw that the giant was directing a glistering rope of its urine onto Declan's upturned face. It splashed into his slackly opened mouth. It ran over his torso. The gleam of joy didn't leave Declan's eyes for a moment as he received this baptism. Indeed, he turned his head from side to side in his eagerness to be totally defiled. The smell of the creature's discharge wafted across to Coot. It was acidic, vile. How could Declan bear to have a drop of it on him, much less bathe in it? Coot wanted to cry out, stop the depravity, but even in the shadow of the yew, the shape of the beast was terrifying. It was too tall and too broad to be human. Surely this was the beast of the wild woods Declan had been trying to describe. This was the child devourer. Had Declan guessed, when he eulogized about this monster, what power it would have over his imagination? Had he known all along that if the beast were to come sniffing for him, he'd kneel in front of it, call it Lord, before Christ, before civilization, he'd said, let it discharge its bladder on him and smile? Yes. Oh, yes. And so, let him have his moment. Don't risk your neck for him, Coot thought. He's where he wants to be. Very slowly, he backed off towards the vestry, his eyes still fixed on the degradation in front of him. The baptism dribbled to a halt, but Declan's hands, cupped in front of him, still held a quantity of fluid. He put the heels of his hands to his mouth and drank. Coot gagged, unable to prevent himself. For an instant he closed his eyes to shut out the sight and opened them again to see that the shadowy head had turned towards him and was looking at him with eyes that burned in the blackness. Christ Almighty! It saw him. For certain this time it saw him. It roared, and its head changed shape in the shadow. Its mouth opened so horribly wide. Sweet Jesus! Already it was charging towards him, antelope lithe, leaving its acolyte slumped beneath the tree. Coot turned and ran as he hadn't in many a long year, hurdling the graves as he fled. It was just a few yards, the door, some kind of safety. Not for long, maybe, but time to think, to find a weapon. Run, you old bastard! Christ the race! Christ the prize! 4 yards! Run! The door was open. Almost there, a yard to go. He crossed the threshold and swung round to slam the door on his pursuer. But no, Rawhead had shot his hand through the door, a hand 3 times the size of a human hand. It was snatching at the empty air, trying to find Coot. The roars relentless. Coot threw his full weight against the door. The door stile, edged with iron, bit into Rawhead's forearm. The roar became a howl. Venom and agony mingled in a din that was heard from one end of Zeel to the other. It stained the night as far as the North Road, where the remains of Gissing and his driver were being scraped up and parcelled in plastic. It echoed around the icy walls of the Chapel of Rest, where Denny and Gwen Nicholson were already beginning to degenerate. It was heard, too, in the bedrooms of Zeel, where living couples lay side by side, maybe an arm numbed under the other's body, where the old lay awake, wondering out the geography of the ceiling, where children dreamt of the womb and babies mourned it. It was heard again and again and again, as Rawhead raged at the door. The howl made Coot's head swim. His mouth babbled prayers, but the much-needed support from on high showed no sign of coming. He felt his strength ebbing away. The giant was steadily gaining access, pressing the door open inch by inch. Coot's feet slid on the too well-polished floor. His muscles were fluttering as they faltered. This was a contest he had no chance of winning, not if he tried to match his strength to that of the beast, sinew for sinew. If he was to see tomorrow morning, he needed some strategy. Coot pressed harder against the wood, his eyes darting around the hallway looking for a weapon. It mustn't get in. It mustn't have mastery over him. A bitter smell was in his nostrils. For a moment he saw himself naked and kneeling in front of the giant with its piss beating on his skull. Hard on the heels of that picture came another flurry of depravities. It was all he could do to not let it in, let the obscenities get a permanent hold. Its mind was working its way into his, a thick wedge of filth pressing its way through his memories, encouraging buried thoughts to the surface. Wouldn't it ask for worship just like any god, and wouldn't its demands be plain and real, not ambiguous like those of the Lord he'd served up until now? That was a fine thought, to give himself up to this certainty that beat on the other side of the door, and lie open in front of it, and let it ravage him. Rawhead. Its name was a pulse in his ear. Rawhead. In desperation, knowing his fragile mental defences were within an ace of collapsing, his eyes alighted on the clothes stand to the left of the door. Rawhead. Rawhead. The name was an imperative. Rawhead. Rawhead. It evoked a skinned head, its defences peeled back, a thing close to bursting. No telling if it was in pain or pleasure, but easy to find out. It almost had possession of him. He knew it. It was now or never. He took one arm from the door and stretched towards the rack for a walking stick. There was one amongst them he wanted in particular. He called this his cross-country stick, 1.5 yards of stripped ash, well used and resilient. His fingers coaxed it towards him. Rawhead had taken advantage of the lack of force behind the door. Its leathery arm was working its way in, indifferent to the way the door jamb scored its skin. The hand, its fingers strong as steel, had caught the folds of Coot's jacket. Coot raised the ash stick and brought it down on Rawhead's elbow, where the bone was vulnerably close to the surface. The weapon splintered on impact, but it did the job. On the other side of the door, the howl began again, as Rawhead's arm was rapidly withdrawn. As the fingers slid out, Coot slammed the door and bolted it. There was a short hiatus, seconds only, before the attack began again, this time a two-fisted beating on the door. The hinges began to buckle. The wood groaned. It would be a short time, a very short time, before it gained access. It was strong, and now it was furious too. Coot crossed the hall and picked up the phone. "Police," he said, and began to dial. How long before it put 2 and 2 together, gave up on the door and moved to the windows? They were leaded, but that probably wouldn't keep it out for long. He had minutes at the most, probably seconds, depending on its brain power. His mind, loosed from Rawhead's grasp, was a chorus of fragmented prayers and demands. If I die, he found himself thinking, will I be rewarded in heaven for dying more brutally than any country vicar might reasonably expect? Is there compensation in paradise for being disembowelled in the front hall of your own vestry? There was only one officer left on duty at the police station. The rest were up on the North Road, clearing up after Gissing's party. The poor man could make very little sense of Reverend Coot's pleas, but there was no mistaking the sound of splintering wood that accompanied the babbles, nor the howling in the background. The officer put the phone down and radioed for help. The patrol on the North Road took 20, maybe 25 seconds to answer. In that time, Rawhead had smashed the central panel of the vestry door and was now demolishing the rest. Not that the patrol knew that. After the sights they'd faced up there, the chauffeur's charred body and Gissing's missing manhood, they had become insolent with experience, like our old war veterans. It took the officer at the station a good minute to convince them of the urgency in Coote's voice. In that time, Rawhead had gained access. In the hotel, Ron Milton watched the parade of lights blinking on the hill, heard the sirens and Rawhead's howls, and was besieged by doubts. Was this really the quiet country village he had intended to settle himself and his family in? He looked down at Maggie, who had been woken by the noise but was now asleep again, her bottle of sleeping tablets almost empty on the bedside cabinet. He felt, though she would have laughed at him for it, protective towards her. He wanted to be her hero. She was the one who took the self-defense night classes, however, while he grew overweight on expense account lunches. It made him inexplicably sad to watch her sleep, knowing he had so little power over life and death. Rawhead stood in the hall of the vestry in a confetti of shattered wood. His torso was pin-pricked with splinters, and dozens of tiny wounds bled down his heaving bulk. His sour sweat permeated the hall like incense. He sniffed the air for the man, but he was nowhere near. Rawhead bared his teeth in frustration, expelled a thin whistle of air from the back of his throat, and loped down the hall towards the study. There was warmth there. His nerves could feel it at 20 yards, and there was comfort too. He overturned the desk and shattered 2 of the chairs, partly to make more room for himself, mostly out of sheer destructiveness, then threw away the fireguard and sat down. Warmth surrounded him, healing, living warmth. He luxuriated in the sensation as it embraced his face, his lean belly, his limbs. He felt it heat his blood too, and so stir memories of other fires he'd set in fields of burgeoning wheat. As he recalled another fire, the memory of which his mind tried to dodge and duck, but he couldn't avoid thinking about it. The humiliation of that night would be with him forever. They'd picked their seasons so carefully, high summer, and no rain in 2 months. The undergrowth of the wild woods was tinder dry, even the living tree caught the flame easily. He had been flushed out of his fortress with steaming eyes, confused and fearful, to be met with spikes and nets on every side, and that thing they had, that sight that could subdue him. Of course they weren't courageous enough to kill him. They were too superstitious for that. Besides, didn't they recognize this authority, even as they wounded him, their terror, a homage to it? So they buried him alive, and that was worse than death. Ron Milton was tasting tears, and it was a taste he'd forgotten. It was many years since he'd wept, especially in front of other males. But he didn't care any longer. These bastard policemen weren't human anyway. They just looked at him while he poured out his story and nodded like idiots. "We've drafted men in from every division within 50 miles, Mr. Milton," said the bland face with the understanding eyes. "The hills are being scoured. We'll have it, whatever it is." "My child, do you understand me? It killed him in front of me." They didn't seem to appreciate the horror of it all. "We're doing what we can." "It's not enough. This thing, it's not human." Ivanhoe, with the understanding eyes, knew bloody well how unhuman it was. "There's people coming from the Ministry of Defence. We can't do much more till they've had a look at the evidence," he said, then added as a sop, "It's all public money, sir." "You fucking idiot! What does it matter what it costs to kill it? It's not human. It's out of hell." Ivanhoe's look lost compassion. "If it came out of hell, sir," he said, "I don't think it would have found the Reverend Coote such easy pickings." Coote. That was his man. Why hadn't he thought of that before? Coote. Ron had never been much of a man of God, but he was prepared to be open-minded, and now that he'd seen the opposition, or one of its troops, he was ready to reform his opinions. He'd believe anything at all, if it gave him a weapon against the devil. He must get to Coot. "What about your wife?" the officer called after him. Maggie was sitting in one of the side offices, dumb with sedation, Debbie asleep beside her. There was nothing he could do for them. They were as safe here as anywhere. He must get to Coot before he died. He'd know whatever reverends know, and he'd understand the pain better than these monkeys. Dead sons were the crux of the church, after all. As he got into the car, it seemed for a moment he smelt his son, the boy who would have carried his name, Ian Ronald Milton, he'd been christened. The boy who was his sperm made flesh, who he'd had circumcised like himself. The quiet child who looked out of the car at him with such resignation in his eyes. This time the tears didn't begin. This time there was just an anger that was almost wonderful. It was 11:30 at night. Rawhead Rex lay under the moon in one of the harvested fields to the southwest of the Nicholson farm. The stubble was darkening now, and there was a tantalizing smell of rotten vegetable matter off the earth. Beside him lay his dinner, Ian Ronald Milton, face up on the field, his midriff torn open. Occasionally the beast would lean up on one elbow and paddle its fingers in the cooling soup of the boy-child's body, fishing for a delicacy. Here, under the full moon, bathing in silver, stretching his limbs and eating the flesh of humankind, he felt irresistible. His fingers drew a kidney off the plate beside him, and he swallowed it whole. Sweet. Coot was awake, despite the sedation. He knew he was dying, and the time was too precious to doze through. He didn't know the name of the face that was interrogating him in the yellow gloom of his room, but the voice was so politely insistent he had to listen, even though it interrupted his peacemaking with God. Besides, they had questions in common, and they all circled, those questions, on the beast that had reduced him to this pulp. "It took my son," the man said. "What do you know about the thing? Please tell me. I'll believe whatever you tell me." Now there was desperation. "Just explain." Time and again, as he'd lain on that hot pillow, confused thoughts had raced through Coot's mind. Declan's baptism, the embrace of the beast, the altar, his hair rising and his flesh too. Maybe there was something he could tell the father at his bedside. "In the church." Ron leaned closer to Coot. He smelt of earth already. "The altar. It's afraid. The altar." "What, you mean the cross? It's afraid of the cross?" "No. Not... The body creaked once and stopped. Ron watched death come over the face, the saliva dry on Coot's lips, the iris of his remaining eye contract. He watched a long while before he rang for the nurse, then quietly made his escape. There was somebody in the church. The door, which had been padlocked by the police, was ajar, the lock smashed. Ron pushed it open a few inches and slid inside. There were no lights on in the church. The only illumination was a bonfire on the altar steps. It was being tended by a young man Ron had seen on and off in the village. He looked up from his fire watching, but kept feeding the flames the guts of books. "What can I do for you?" he asked without interest. "I came to..." Ron hesitated. What to tell this man? The truth? No. There was something wrong here. "I asked you a frigging question," said the man. "What do you want?" As he walked down the aisle towards the fire, Ron began to see the questioner in more detail. There were stains like mud on his clothes, and his eyes had sunk in their orbits as if his brain had sucked them in. "You've got no right to be in here." "I thought anyone could go into a church," said Ron, staring at the burning pages as they blackened. "Not tonight. You get the fuck out of here." Ron kept walking towards the altar. "You get the fuck out, I said." The face in front of Ron was alive with leers and grimaces. There was lunacy in it. "I came to see the altar. I'll go when I've seen it, and not before." "You've been talking to Coot, that it?" "Coot? What did the old wanker tell you?" "It's all a lie. Whatever it was, he never told the truth in his freaking life. You know that? You take it from me. He used to get up there," he threw a prayer book at the pulpit, "and tell fucking lies." "I want to see the altar for myself. We'll see if he was telling lies." "No, you won't!" The man threw another handful of books onto the fire and stepped down to block Ron's path. He smelt not of mud, but of shit. Without warning, he pounced. His hands seized Ron's neck, and the two of them toppled over. Declan's fingers reached to gouge at Ron's eyes, his teeth snapping at his nose. Ron was surprised at the weakness of his own arms. Why hadn't he played squash the way Maggie had suggested? Why were his muscles so ineffectual? If he wasn't careful, this man was going to kill him. Suddenly a light, so bright it could have been a midnight dawn, splashed through the west window. A cloud of screams followed close on it. Firelight, dwarfing the bonfire on the altar steps, dyed the air. The stained glass danced. Declan forgot his victim for an instant, and Ron rallied. He pushed the man's chin back and got a knee under his torso. Then he kicked hard. The enemy went reeling, and Ron was up and after him, a fistful of hair securing the target, while the ball of his other hand hammered at the lunatic's face till it broke. It wasn't enough to see the bastard's nose bleed or to hear the cartilage mashed. Ron kept beating and beating until his fist bled. Only then did he let Declan drop. Outside, Zeel was ablaze. Rawhead had made fires before, many fires, but petrol was a new weapon, and he was still getting the hang of it. It didn't take him long to learn. The trick was to wound the wheeled boxes. That was easy. Open their flanks and out their blood would pour, blood that made his head ache. The boxes were easy prey, lined up on the pavement like bullocks to be slaughtered. He went amongst them, demented with death, splashing their blood down the high street and igniting it. Streams of liquid fire poured into gardens, over thresholds. Thatches caught. Wood beams, cottages went up. In minutes, Zeel was burning from end to end. In St. Peter's, Ron dragged the filthied cloth off the altar, trying to block out all thoughts of Debbie and Margaret. The police would move them to a place of safety for certain. The issue at hand must take precedence. Beneath the cloth was a large box, its front panel roughly carved. He took no notice of the design. There were more urgent matters to attend to. Outside, the beast was loose. He could hear its triumphant roars, and he felt eager, yes, eager, to go to it, to kill or to be killed. But first, the box. It contained power, no doubt of that. A power that was even now raising his hairs on his head, that was working at his cock, giving him an aching hard-on. His flesh seemed to seethe with it. It elated him like love. Hungry, he put his hands on the box, and a shock that seemed to cook his joints ran up both arms. He fell back, and for a moment he wondered if he was going to remain conscious. The pain was so bad, but it subsided in moments. He cast around for a tool, something to get him into the box without laying flesh to it. In desperation, he wrapped his hand with a piece of the altar cloth and snatched one of the brass candle holders from the edge of the fire. The cloth began to smoulder as the heat worked its way through to his hand. He stepped back to the altar and beat at the wood like a madman until it began to splinter. His hands were numb now. If the heated candlesticks were burning his palms, he couldn't feel it. Would it matter anyhow? There was a weapon here, a few inches away from him. If only he could get to it, to wield it. His erection throbbed. His balls tingled. "Come to me," he found himself saying. "Come on, come on, come to me, come to me." Like he was willing it to his embrace, this treasure, like it was a girl he wanted, his hard-on wanted, and he was hypnotising her into his bed. "Come to me, come to me, come to me." The wood facade was breaking. Panting now, he used the corners of the candlestick base to lever large chunks of timber away. The altar was hollow, as he'd known it would be, and empty. Empty. Except for a ball of stone the size of a small football. Was this his prize? He couldn't believe how insignificant it looked. And yet the air was still electric around him. His blood still danced. He reached through the hole he'd made in the altar and picked the relic up. Outside, Rawhead was jubilating. Images flashed before Ron's eyes as he waved the stone in his deadened hand. A corpse with its feet burning, a flaming cot, a dog running along the street, a living ball of fire. It was all outside, waiting to unfold. Against the perpetrator, he had this stone. He trusted God just for half a day, and he got shat on. It was just a stone, just a fucking stone. He turned the football over and over in his hand, trying to make some sense of its furrows and its mounds. Was it meant to be something, perhaps? Was he missing its deeper significance? There was a knot of noise at the other end of the church, a crash, a cry. From beyond the door, a whoosh of flame. 2 people staggered in, followed by smoke and pleas. "He's burning the village," said a voice Ron knew. It was that benign policeman who hadn't believed in hell. He was trying to keep his act together, perhaps for the benefit of his companions, Mrs. Splatter from the hotel. The nightdress she'd run into the street wearing was torn. Her breasts were exposed. They shook with her sobs. She didn't seem to know she was naked, didn't even know where she was. "Christ in heaven, help us," said Ivanhoe. "There's no fucking Christ in here," came Declan's voice. He was standing up and reeling towards the intruders. Ron couldn't see his face from where he stood, but he knew it must be near as damn it unrecognisable. Mrs. Splatter avoided him as he staggered towards the door, and she ran towards the altar. She'd been married here, on the very spot he'd built the fire. Ron stared at her body, entranced. She was considerably overweight, her breasts sagging, her belly overshadowing her cunt, so he doubted if she could even see it. But it was for this his cock-head throbbed, for this his head reeled. Her image was in his hand. God, yes, she was there in his hand. She was the living equivalent of what he held. She was there in his hand. She was the living equivalent of what he held. A woman. The stone was the statue of a woman. A Venus grosser than Mrs. Splatter, her belly swelling with children, tits like mountains, cunt a valley that began at her navel and gaped to the world. All this time, under the cloth and the cross, they bowed their heads to a goddess. Ron stepped off the altar and began to run down the aisle, pushing Mrs. Splatter, the policeman, and the lunatic aside. "Don't go out," said Ivanhoe. "It's right outside." Ron held the Venus tight, feeling her weight in his hands and taking security from her. Behind him, the verger was screeching a warning to his lord. Yes, it was a warning for sure. Ron kicked open the door. On every side, fire, a flaming cot, a corpse, it was the postmaster, with its feet burning, a dog skinned by fire hurtling past, and Rawhead, of course, silhouetted against a panorama of flames. It looked round, perhaps because it heard the warnings the verger was yelling, but more likely, he thought, because it knew without being told, that the woman had been found. "Here!" Ron yelled. "I'm here! I'm here!" It was coming for him now, with the steady gait of a victor closing in to claim its final and absolute victory. Doubt surged up in Ron. Why did it come so surely to meet him, not seeming to care about the weapon he carried in his hands? Hadn't it seen? Hadn't it heard the warning? Unless... Oh, God in heaven. Unless Coot had been wrong. Unless it was only a stone he held in his hands, a useless, meaningless lump of stone. Then a pair of hands grabbed him round the neck. The lunatic. A low voice spat the word, "Fucker," in his ear. Ron watched Rawhead approaching, heard the lunatic screeching now, "Here it is, fetch him! Kill him, here it is!" Without warning, the grip slackened, and Ron half turned to see Ivanhoe dragging the lunatic back against the church hall. The mouth in the verger's broken face continued to screech, "He's here! Here! Here!" Ron looked back at Rawhead. The beast was almost on him, and he was too slow to raise the stone in self-defence, but Rawhead had no intention of taking him. It was Declan he was smelling and hearing. Ivanhoe released Declan as Rawhead's huge hands veered past Ron and fumbled for the lunatic. What followed was unwatchable. Ron couldn't bear to see the hands take Declan apart, but he heard the gabble of pleas become whoops of disbelieving grief. When he looked around, there was nothing recognisably human on ground or wall. And Rawhead was coming for him now, coming to do the same or worse. The huge head craned round to fix on Ron, its maw gaping, and Ron saw how the fire had wounded Forehead. The beast had been careless in the enthusiasm for destruction. Fire had caught its face and upper torso. Its body hair was crisped, its mane was stubble, and the flesh on the left-hand side of its face was black and blistered. The flames had roasted its eyeballs. They were swimming in gums of mucus and tears. That was why it had followed Declan's voice and bypassed Ron. It could scarcely see. But it must see now. It must. "Here, here," said Ron. "Here I am," Rawhead heard. He looked without seeing, his eyes trying to focus. "Here, I'm here!" Rawhead growled in his chest. His burned face pained him. He wanted to be away from here, away in the cool of a birch thicket, moon-washed. His dimmed eyes found the stone. The Homo sapien was nursing it like a baby. It was difficult for Rawhead to see clearly, but he knew. It ached in his mind, that image. It pricked him. It teased him. It was just a symbol, of course, a sign of the power, not the power itself. But his mind made no such distinction. To him, the stone was the thing he feared most. The bleeding woman, her gaping hole, eating seed and spitting children. It was life, that hole, that woman. It was endless fecundity. It terrified him. Rawhead stepped back, his own shit running freely down his leg. The fear on his face gave Ron strength. He pressed home his advantage, closing in after the retreating beast, dimly aware that Ivanhoe was rallying allies around him, armed figures waiting at the corners of his vision, eager to bring the fire razor down. His own strength was failing him. The stone, lifted high above his head so Rawhead could see it plainly, seemed heavier by the moment. "Go on," he said quietly to the gathering zealots. "Go on, take him. Take him." They began to close in even before he finished speaking. Rawhead smelt them more than saw them. His hurting eyes were fixed on the woman. His teeth slid from their sheaths in preparation for the attack. The stench of humanity closed around him from every direction. Panic overcame his superstitions for one moment, and he snatched down towards Ron, sealing himself against the stone. The attack took Ron by surprise. The claws sank in his scalp. Blood poured down over his face. Then the crowd closed in. Human hands, weak, white human hands, were laid on Rawhead's body. Fists beat on his spine. Nails raked his skin. He let Ron go as someone took a knife to the backs of his legs and hamstrung him. The agony made him howl the sky down, or so it seemed. In Rawhead's roasted eyes the stars reeled as he fell backwards onto the road, his back cracking under him. They took the advantage immediately, overpowering him by sheer weight of numbers. He snapped off a finger here, a face there, but they would not be stopped now. Their hatred was old. In their bones, did they but know it. He thrashed under their assaults for as long as he could, but he knew death was certain. There would be no resurrection this time, no waiting in the earth for an age until their descendants forgot him. He'd be snuffed out absolutely, and there would be nothingness. He became quieter at the thought, and looked up as best he could to where the little father was standing. Their eyes met as they had on the road when he'd taken the boy, but now Rawhead's look had lost its power to transfix. His face was empty and sterile as the moon, defeated long before Ron slammed the stone down between his eyes. The skull was soft. It buckled inwards, and a slop of brain spattered the road. The king went out. It was suddenly over, without ceremony or celebration. Out once and for all. There was no cry. Ron left the stone where it lay, half buried in the face of the beast. He stood up groggily and felt his head. His scalp was loose. His fingertips touched his skull. Blood came and came. But there were arms to support him, and nothing to fear if he slept. It went unnoticed, but in death Rawhead's bladder was emptying. A stream of urine pulsed from the corpse and ran down the road. The rivulet streamed in the chilling air, its scummy nose sniffing left and right as it looked for a place to drain. After a few feet it found the gutter and ran along it a while to a crack in the tarmac. There it drained off into the welcoming earth.
Alrighty, so that was Rawhead Rex. You know, what a story! What a story! It was one of the longer ones of Books of Blood, and the thing is that it was one of the first ones in Books of Blood to be adapted into a film. Though the thing is that the film was a lot less bloody than the story, and they made a lot of changes on the Rawhead Rex character itself. They also went and they changed the husband and the family. They were, in the movie, they were Americans coming to Ireland, whereas in the book they were Londoners. You know, interesting thing about that. Yeah, I mean, Clive Barker makes it a point to mention the fact that the town of Zeel had withstand all these conquerors and stuff, but it ended up that it was the weekend vacationers and that brought the ancient village down. And, you know, it was the fact that Londoners and people from the city would come in and buy up the farms and make their little luxury holiday houses there. You know, similar things things are actually happening in Virginia as well. You know, I don't know if you recall about this, Mr. Highland.
I'm not sure.
Okay, our dear buddy, Mr. Derek Young, was talking about it, and he actually gave that to me as information for Psychotic State. And the thing was that, you know, tech people from California and that have been moving into Virginia. And literally taking over towns in Virginia and pushing the local, the families that have been there, you know, for generations, moving them to the side. And it's the same thing that happened in Zeel, is the fact that these, you know, well-off Londoners were coming into this little town, buying up the land and pushing the locals who had been there for generations, pushing them out and bringing in their own, you know, bringing their own lifestyle and culture into this village. And thus, you know, pretty much destroying it. You know, changing it from being a simple farming community, you know, a nice, quaint little farming community into this thing. And Barker kind of presents this as one of the reasons why Rawhead Rex was eventually let free, was because, you know, over the years, the farmers had been pushed away and they knew the secret of Rawhead, and, you know, the younger generation in the village, they had been changed because of the influence of the Londoners and that and their culture. So they ignored the old culture. It's a well-known fact that these old Irish villages and that, they were all once pagan, and they were converted into Christians by the Romans, yet the thing is they maintained some of their culture by disguising it through, in Christianity. Like the the maypole dance and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyways, you got anything to put in on this, about the background on this?
Well, not really. I mean, I meant to listen to the story again for this show, but I didn't get around to it because I didn't know when we were going to do this show. It kept getting put off. And recently I looked at the pictures of the comic book adaptation, and I must say well, for one thing, the art was great, and second of all, I prefer the original story to the movie, because the movie cut out a lot and changed a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, it did, and that's one reason why Clive Barker was really disgusted with it.
I finally got around to seeing the movie, and I was really disappointed with some of the aspects, especially the ending.
Yeah,
the last shot of it, I just said to myself, well, that was cheap.
Very much so.
It was a cheap shot.
God, I still remember that. Oh, yeah, we're going to try to make a franchise out of it by having Rawhead come back up. Yeah, right.
Yeah, that doesn't happen with the original story. I remember the original story, there's a very final denouement of Rawhead, where you actually see him killed in a very final way.
Oh yeah, it's like
well, he's not coming back.
Gang up on him.
Yeah, he's not coming back yet.
And Ron actually puts in the coup de grace on him. Yeah, the thing is that they royally changed it. They decided to go for a magic ending, which...
Yeah, I mean, is that because of the budget or no?
I have no idea. All I know is that Clive was totally against it. He refused when the filmmakers were giving him a bad time about it, refused to change the ending, so they let him go and they brought in another writer to rewrite Rawhead Rex. And this was the second time it had happened to Clive Barker.
Oh, what was the first?
It happened with his original film, Underworld, aka Transmutation.
I don't know that one.
Yeah, it was Clive Barker's first screenplay that got made into a feature film. And the thing was that it was kind of like an earlier version of Cabal, Nightbreed.
Oh.
The original idea for it. And what happened is that the studio changed it quite a bit. They threw in whole thing with a mad scientist and drugs and stuff. This drug that turns people into monsters. And just totally changed Clive Barker's story in that respect. There was still somewhat of an idea of it, because, they still kept in the brothel thing where there was a brothel that had one of these beings in there, a prostitute named Nicole, who could, who could bring out your deepest desire. And the thing was that this one, he was kind of like a former bodyguard for the underworld, one of the muscle guys. He was actually a bodyguard in the brothel, worked for the madam there years before, and he had fallen in love with the prostitute, Nicole. And so because of that, he got thrown out and ended up having to work for a gang boss and stuff for a while. Became very rich in that. And anyways, the story was about him being brought back in because Nicole had been kidnapped. And he had to find Nicole. And by finding Nicole, he finds out about this underworld underneath the city where these monsters lived. Kind of like Midian and that. But in the rewrite, these were people who had been changed by this doctor. Anyways, so that was Clive Barker's first screenplay he got sold. They screwed him over. Amusingly enough, in the Rawhead Rex film, they actually use a shot from Transmutations in a scene where remember the scene where they're in the mobile home park?
Yeah.
That Rawhead destroys.
Mhm.
And you had the little kid and his sister and her boyfriend. They were watching television.
Yeah.
That was what was on, was Transmutations.
Oh, what irony.
Yeah. What's interesting is that, in the book, this happens as well. Everything happens that's in the book, just slightly different, in Rawhead Rex. And, you actually get into the mind of this creature, because he's, in the movie he's more seems more animalistic.
Yeah.
Whereas in the book, you get into his mind and he's thinking about how he used to be worshipped and stuff, and how he was the master of the land and that, and humans bowed to him because he was stronger and greater than them. It's interesting. It gives him a little bit more personality. Wouldn't you say, Mr. Highland?
You get the feeling of that. I mean, especially by looking at the pictures of him in the comic book.
Yeah. Also, there's a couple of scenes. They never did this in the movie, but there was this one scene after he goes and he kills the main character, Ron's son. There's a scene of him. He's laying in a field, just lazing around, looking up at the moon, and he's playing with his food. He's sticking his clawed hand into Ron's son's body and looking for, some prime morsels to eat. And he pulls out his liver and starts eating it very casually. It's kind of an interesting image.
Yeah, I think that's one of the pictures I'm looking at from the comic book.
Yeah. Also, the movie the movie's Rawhead Rex was totally a different design. I mean, he even had clothes, whereas the Rawhead Rex in the movie, in the book, he's totally naked.
Yeah.
Yeah, whereas the Rawhead Rex in the movie, he's got kind of like this, what is it, a fur thing around his waist and stuff.
Yeah.
He's got didn't he have jewelry on and stuff? And things around his wrists?
I think so, if I remember correctly.
Yeah. Yeah. I found it funny in regard to the movie. They had no way to make his mouth move in the movie, if you notice.
Yeah.
So the costume always had this mouth open with these big-ass teeth, oversized teeth, that even if it was real, it couldn't have closed its mouth because of the size of these damn molars.
Yeah, so you never see him bite anyone, or when you do see him, you don't see him that often. You just see him with that expression.
Yeah. And then, of course, the description of Rawhead's eyes were that his eyes were ablaze. They were red. They were like light. Like red headlights coming out of his head. And you see the movie, and what did they do, Mr. Highland? Do you remember that?
They were like glowing red.
Nah, really what it was is they had like these little fire circles going around the pupil. It was like, oh my God, that is
something like that, yeah.
Yeah, that was hilarious. And they only showed that in one shot.
Yeah.
And I even know the reason why, because the damn thing malfunctioned. And they couldn't do the glow anymore. They only had it for one shot. It was like the robot in Lost in Space with the little dilly whackers that would spin and stuff. it stopped working, so they didn't have the budget to fix it. Another interesting piece of trivia is that entire Rawhead Rex suit was actually one piece. They sculpted it as one piece. And they had a thing down the back, a zipper in that was hidden. And the guy would have to literally climb into this suit, head and everything. And it was the most claustrophobic thing this guy had ever done, because it was rubber. It was literally rubber. It was hot as hell. Supposedly the actor, this German guy, almost passed out a half dozen times while just walking around in the damn thing. But anyways, yeah, I mean, you look at Barker's image of Rawhead Rex. He had that huge, what was it? Almost an oval head with this big maw of teeth. And the thing is that his teeth would retract into the mouth, and he'd look almost like a melon with two big eye things and a couple of holes for a nose.
Yeah.
And this big little line of hair around the back.
Yeah.
And
the hair kind of reminds me of my hair, except I'm not bald on top.
Yeah, it's kind of like that. Oh, I'm a bald guy and I've got long. I let my hair grow out from half bald and have it dragging down the back of you to make up for the fact that you're bald on top. Funny as hell. I've seen a few of those guys, and it's funny. You look like one of those. You look like one of the dwarves from The Hobbit when they do that. But anyways, yeah, I mean, and then the thing is that Rawhead Rex's body was big, but he had been in the ground for so long and had been starving. So the thing is that this creature was practically starved. He wasn't at his full strength during the story. If he had been, oh my God, it would have been worse. I mean, it was amusing. Huh?
So that's why at the end of the story he was able to be torn apart.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, you think about it. He'd spent thousands of years, or hundreds of years, stuck under the ground, not, unable to eat anything, just basically, living off of his own body. And yeah, I mean, when you notice in the comic book, they really showed that, because the body's really emaciated in that.
Yeah.
And yeah. And that's one of the reasons why he goes on this killing spree. It's because he needs food. He's hungry. And I mean, he just goes through and he eats a guy that pulled him out of the ground. that's an interesting thing. Did you get the impression that Rawhead Rex had sort of a power over people too?
Yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, it seemed like he willed that guy after his presence was shown. When his hand was holding the what was it, a shovel or something, a pick, the pick that the guy was using. He grabbed a hold of it, and then the guy all of a sudden he's forced to pull Rawhead Rex out of the pit, out of the hole. He can't stop himself. He's willed to do that. And then Rawhead eats him. And that huh?
I could just imagine someone doing a parody of the character where he goes to a restaurant and orders everything on the menu.
Yeah, that'd be funny, seeing a naked demon come walking in.
Yeah, and dressed like an 80s rock, or dressed like an 80s rock star. But yes, I like to have everything on the menu.
Oh, okay. So you're going for the creepy voice.
Yeah,
I was
doing like that.
My name's Rawhead Rex, and I want the everything on the menu right now, and could you please bring me a little wine here? That's nice, Oh, and while you're at it, cut your throat and give me some of your blood, please. That would be very nice. And no, I don't want that waitress, because she's having her period, and I don't like period women. So, just move her along. Bring me Bruno over there. I'll eat him first.
Okay, listeners, you decide which voice Rawhead Rex would most likely have.
Yeah. Yeah, okay. Yeah, people, go ahead and put it on Facebook, which one you like better, Mr. Highland's or mine. I'm just being funny. Anyway, so yeah, and he did, Rawhead did seem to have enough power that he went and he affected the Verger as well. I mean, that was a total weird thing, huh? With the Verger. I mean, shoot, 1 minute he's this 29-year-old, just helping out the local priest and doing stuff, and all of a sudden he turns into this fucking psycho madman who's sitting there burning prayer books and wanting the demon to piss on him. I don't know. I mean, I may be off on that. I mean, honestly, Mr. Highland, would you honestly see a Verger wanting to have a demon piss on him?
I don't know.
Yeah, you don't even know what a Verger is. Of course, I don't know what a Verger is.
You're gonna have to explain it to me.
But anyways, yeah, he's the assistant to the priest.
Oh, okay, all right.
Yeah. And I mean, seriously, I mean, I gather that more than likely what it was the verger was one of the locals. That his family line had went all the way back to when Rawhead was in power. And he had been interested in the history, and he had read about Rawhead in the secret church files. So I wonder if that helped Rawhead focus on him and bring out the aggressive and that, and the, kind of corrupt him. What do you think?
Possible.
Yeah. I mean, seriously, in the beginning of the story, you think that he really likes Reverend Coot. And then all of a sudden he's sacrificing Reverend Coot to Rawhead, letting Rawhead rip him up. Of course, I don't know. I mean, he was there at the end, kind of really nutsy. As I said, he was burning the books out in front of the church, which, the way that the film, or the way that the book presents it, is that the church had been built on top of the ceremonial grounds that people worshipped Rawhead. And that the God, what is it? The thing up at the where they put the God damn it. Oh God. Supposedly it's a table or thing where they put the candles and stuff, and they cover it with the
altar
cloth and the altar. Yeah, the altar was in fact an altar stone that had been part of the original pagan church that had been there. Because that's where the pagans had their weapon against Rawhead, which was the fertility symbol. Because Rawhead has an aversion to birth and pregnant women. He absolutely hates pregnant women. He can't stand that. He also cannot stand women when they're having their period, because supposedly it fouls the blood for him, so he can't eat a menstruating female. That's why when he attacks that farm, he eats the kid, he eats the husband, he eats the horse, but he leaves the wife uneaten. Because he can't stand it. He can't even stand the smell of her. So, in the movie they make a lot more out of this fertility symbol, but in this it's got power, but it doesn't it doesn't have any real magic against Rawhead. It's just its symbology that Rawhead fears. He doesn't fear the cross. He doesn't fear any Christian symbol, but he fears the fertility symbol because of what it represents, which is childbirth. Interesting, huh?
Hmm.
Yeah. Hell, why don't you let the fans know what they changed, in regard to the fertility symbol in the movie?
I think it's some kind of sword or something.
Huh?
I think it's a sword. I could be wrong.
No,
Or-
it was
or
still a
some kind of
fertility symbol. But the thing is that a man couldn't wield it. It had to be a woman
Yeah.
who wielded it, and it shot a laser out of its face.
Yeah.
And supposedly that laser would drag Rawhead into the dirt. Which was a cheaper way of ending the film. Oh yes, we just have the lady hold up the fertility symbol, do a special effects laser effect, and have Rawhead be dragged into the earth. Like, eek. I prefer the ending where the villagers, because, the reason why the villagers are coming to the church anyways is because dear old Rawhead Rex burns down Zeel. He literally burns down the entire town because he found out about cars and gasoline. Oh boy. And found out that they can start fires. Of course, by the time he gets to the church, he's actually made a couple mistakes and actually burned the side of his face and stuff. But he did manage to destroy the entire town. Because he broke every car in town and let the gas flow into the streets. Interesting. Anyways, any point that you want to point out, Mr. Highland, that was interesting?
No, other than I feel this movie should be remade.
Oh, definitely. Definitely, we need a CGI. Definitely need a CGI Rawhead.
Why does it have to be that? Couldn't it be practical effects?
No, I don't think with the way the Rawhead character is, you could actually mix practical and special effects like they do with the Alien.
Yeah, okay.
Because actually, Rawhead kind of reminds me of the exomorph from Prometheus in some ways.
Oh.
Yeah, at least body-wise in that, and amusingly enough, I was recently looking at Funko Pops, and they did a Funko Pop of the exomorph. And they did an exomorph with a big head, and if you know the exomorph, it had the human teeth, right? From Prometheus, and it was albino. So you had this big albino thing with these human teeth and this big ass head. And I was thinking, man, that would have made a halfway decent Rawhead. Except it didn't have any eyes. But yeah, I mean, they've been doing some miracles. I mean, you look at the Demogorgon from Stranger Things and stuff. That one, those are interesting in that. So yeah, this is prime time for them to actually, honestly, I think that Clive Barker should take up the reins. If it wasn't for the fact that he's so sick right now, he should take up the reins and do a remake of Rawhead Rex and do it the way that he wanted to. Wouldn't you say, Mr. Highland?
Yeah.
Yeah. Do the design that he wanted, everything. He could garner a budget where he could do the destruction of Zeel. He could do everything that he wanted to do with that film. And it would be fantastic. At least I think so. I know you think so too. I mean, if it was anything like the comic books, well, the one adaptation of the story that they did as a comic book. The other one, I wasn't too thrilled with that because what they did is they actually, the comic book writer got, it was a black and white version of Rawhead Rex, and what they did is they used the Rawhead Rex from the movie.
Oh man! Oh no!
Yeah, and it was like, no. Yeah, that one sucked. So I was very happy when they did the adaptation that you saw, the one that was done with the paintings.
Mm-hmm.
That was far superior. It was fantastic. Anyways, yeah. So what do you think? What was Clive Barker trying to tell us with Rawhead Rex?
Well, this is definitely a story about roots and not forgetting them and not letting people turning places into something they're not.
Pretty much. Yeah, my take on it is that it was no matter what, don't forget the past. Keep your cultural identity. So many people, even the Indians are still trying to fight to maintain their cultural identity, since they've had to deal with the white man.
Yeah.
Because, when the white men put them in the reserve, in the reserve areas, they took away their lands. They even took away the Indians' tribal masks from their culture and tried to turn them into English people. and that kind of scarred the Indian tribes. It's the same with the Irish. The way that the English have dealt with them. Because the Irish lost a lot of their culture because of the English and because of the Romans and that. I mean, do you realize, Mr. Highland, that the Irish even lost their own language?
Oh, you mean the Gaelic language?
Yeah, the Gaelic language was also part of Scottish too.
Oh.
But yeah, Gaelic. Yeah, the Gaelic languages, the pagan languages, all those languages are gone. They've been eliminated, and
Oh, I thought
no one remembers them, and they don't.
Well, I thought there are some. I thought there are some parts that do utilize that language.
Huh. Still there, Mr. Highland? I could hardly hear you.
Yeah, I'm still here.
Okay. But anyways, yeah, so the thing is, yeah, the importance of culture and that, and, these mythologies and legends and that and gods, they had their old gods taken away from them, too. And that was something that Barker was trying to present here, is that modern society in some ways is trying to wipe out the past. And you can't wipe out the past. It's the same thing in this country. They're trying to wipe out our culture in many ways to replace it with a tech culture. You know how it is now. Did you know, Mr. Highland, that in schools they do not teach cursive in school anymore?
I've heard about that, and I've been hearing about them not teaching how to read clocks.
Yeah. Yeah, not how to read clocks and a lot of things. There's basic manners and stuff are not being taught. They used to be taught in schools. Especially in you used to have etiquette and stuff. They used to teach that in Catholic schools and these religious schools, and now they're getting rid of that as well. So all this culture is disappearing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what the main thrust is in regard to Rawhead Rex, is that if you forget your culture and you forget your mythologies and you forget your stuff, your mythology is going to come and kick you in the ass.
Yes.
And in this case, the entire village got taken out. And all them Londoners lost all their pretty little houses and everything. Oh my God. That's something. But yeah. So
I'm surprised that that kind of fun story in horror movies isn't supplied more often.
Yeah. And the thrill with Barker, is the fact that he does acknowledge these things. He acknowledges, you know, he's very much an English writer talking about the common English people. He's not, you know, he's not sticking with the upper crust. He's talking more about the lower classes and stuff in his writing, and how modern society is affecting that. And you see that in a lot of his stuff. I mean, you know, a lot of his stuff about Midian and that, you know, what you can compare it with is that the creatures of Midian are kind of like the horror fans and stuff. We're the geeks, we're the, you know, we're the people who are thrown away and stuff and pushed aside and, you know, ignored and in the background. And Barker tries to say that, you know, you shouldn't ignore what's in the background, because if you do, you can be in deep doo-doo when it comes to that. But anyways, yeah, so you think we've thoroughly analyzed Mr. Rawhead Rex?
Yes.
Excellent. And I am thrilled to say that our next Bloodbath Tales will be a story that Mr. Highland's going to choose.
Yes, and I have one in mind as one by Rodal.
Nice. You'll have to help me find an audiobook, but definitely.
I'll do that.
Yeah, definitely. You're going to have to, because I'm going to have to be able to put it on here.
Oh, it's out there.
Hopefully they got something on YouTube.
Yeah, they do.
Oh, cool. Then that'll work out really good. Alrighty. So, anyways, yeah. So that was Rawhead Rex, and you know, thus ends our trilogy of Clive Barker short stories. So be ready next time when Mr. Highland and I come back for another great audiobook by another great horror author on Bloodbath Theater Tales. So, as always, keep America strong, watch horror films, and listen to your audiobooks. And watch out for that thing in your closet there, people, because it's there and it's watching.
The secret side of me, I never let you see. I keep it caged, but I can't control it. So stay away from me, the beast is ugly. I feel the rage and I just can't hold it. It's scratching on the walls, in the closet, in the halls. It comes awake and I can't control it. Hiding under the bed, in my body, in my head. Why won't somebody come and save me from this? Make it end. I feel it deep within, it's just beneath the skin. I must confess that I feel like a monster. I hate what I've become, the nightmare's just begun. I must confess that I feel like a monster. I feel like a monster. I feel like a monster. save me from this, make it in. I feel it deep within, it's just beneath the skin. I must confess that I feel like a monster. I hate what I've become, the nightmare's just begun. I must confess that I feel like a monster. I feel it deep within, it's just beneath the skin. I must confess that I feel like a monster. I feel like a monster. I feel like a monster. It's hiding in the dark, its teeth are razor sharp. There's no escape for me, it wants my soul, it wants my heart. No one can hear me scream, maybe it's just a dream. Maybe it's inside of me. Stop this monster. I feel it deep within, it's just beneath the skin. I must confess that I feel like a monster. I hate what I've become, the nightmare's just begun. I must confess that I feel like a monster. I feel it deep within, it's just beneath the skin. I must confess that I feel like a monster. I'm gonna lose control, it's something radical. I must confess that I feel like a monster. 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 I feel like a monster.
So we have a containment breach. We lost them. They're out in the open.
Ah!